Okay, so you know how we always hear about boys and girls and how their brains are, like, wired so differently, especially when we're talking about how kids learn and all that. It seems like everyone's always saying boys are better at this or girls are naturally good at that. But what if we could just, cut through all the noise and actually look at some hard evidence, some real research on how those thinking skills develop in kids as they grow?
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic that gets a lot of attention, and sometimes it feels like people are a bit too quick to draw conclusions. So today we're going to dive into a fascinating study. It really tries to get to the bottom of this whole gender and cognition thing in kids.
Right, like, are there actually significant differences between boys and girls when it comes to their cognitive abilities during childhood? That's the big question.
Exactly, and the study we're looking at is called Gender Differences in Cognitive Development. It's by Ardila, Rosselli, Matute, and Inozemtseva. It's a pretty comprehensive investigation, and we've been going through a deep analysis of it to really distill the key findings for you. Because let's be honest, research papers can be dense and sometimes a little overwhelming.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So basically, we're giving you the shortcut to understanding what this big study reveals about how boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 16 develop those crucial thinking skills.
Exactly. Think of this as your guide to navigating the complexities of cognitive development research. So where should we start?
Well, I think it's really interesting how the researchers in this study approached the whole question. They didn't just look at one narrow aspect of cognition. They really tried to capture the big picture by examining a wide age range, all the way from 5 to 16.
Yeah, and they used the same standardized test, the same assessment tool for all the participants, regardless of age or gender, to really get a solid comparison across all those different mental abilities. That's important for consistency.
So speaking of participants, how many kids were actually involved in this research?
Well, it was a pretty substantial sample size. They analyzed data from 788 children, all of whom were Spanish speakers. That included 350 boys and 438 girls, and they came from both Colombia and Mexico. So geographically and culturally, there's some diversity represented.
That's great because it means the findings might be more broadly applicable.
Right, and the researchers were careful to focus on typical development. They made sure to exclude any children who had known neurological or psychiatric conditions, intellectual disabilities, or learning disabilities. They really wanted to hone in on what's considered within the normal range of cognitive development.
Okay, so they had this diverse group of kids, all between 5 and 16. But how did they actually measure all those different cognitive abilities?
Well, they used a test called the Evaluation Neuropsychologica Infantile. It's often referred to as the ENI for short. And this assessment looks at 7 key areas of cognitive function, so it's pretty comprehensive.
7 key areas. Wow, that's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but it helps paint a more detailed picture of how these kids think and learn. So those 7 areas, they included things like constructional abilities. Those are things like drawing and building and memory coding. They looked at both verbal memory, remembering words and stories, and visual memory, remembering images and
Right,
patterns.
so how well they learn and remember different types of information. What else?
They also assessed sensory perception. That means how they process information from their senses, specifically touch and sight.
So like recognizing objects by touch or being able to pick out details in a complex image.
Exactly. And then there was oral language. This looked at how well they can repeat words, express themselves verbally, and understand what's being said to them.
That makes sense. Communication is such a crucial part of development.
Absolutely. They also assess something called metalinguistic awareness, which is kind of like thinking about language itself. It's being able to understand how language works, the rules behind it, and even being able to play with language, like understanding puns or metaphors.
That's really interesting. And then there's spatial abilities, right?
Yes, they looked at those too, both verbal and nonverbal spatial skills.
Oh.
That's things like understanding shapes, mentally rotating objects, and understanding how objects relate to each other in space.
So like being able to navigate, read maps, or maybe even excel at building with blocks.
Exactly, those kinds of skills. And finally, they assessed attention. This included both auditory attention, how well they focus on things they hear, and visual attention, how well they focus on things they see. So it was a really thorough examination of different cognitive skills across a range of areas.
Wow. So they had all this data from all these kids. What were some of the big takeaways, the things that really jumped out at you?
Well, the first thing, and this is probably not a huge surprise, is that age had a significant impact on performance across all 7 of those cognitive areas. The older the child, the better they generally performed on the ENI, regardless of gender.
Right. So that kind of reinforces what we already know. kids' thinking abilities naturally develop as they get older.
Exactly. That was a really clear finding. But now let's get to what everyone's really curious about. Were there actually differences between boys and girls? And the answer, as with most things in science, isn't a simple yes or no.
Okay, so tell us, what did they find? Did boys outperform girls in some areas?
Well, out of those 7 broad areas of cognitive function that they assessed, they only found statistically significant gender differences in 3 of them. And those were in sensory perception, oral language, and spatial abilities.
Okay, so those are 3 areas where we often hear about potential gender differences. What was the pattern? Did boys generally do better in all 3?
Yes. In those 3 areas where they did find a statistically significant difference, the average scores were slightly higher for the boys. But, and this is a really important but, we need to be careful not to overinterpret that finding.
Because a statistically significant difference doesn't necessarily mean a practical difference, right?
Precisely. And that's where this concept of effect size comes in. The researchers calculated something called partial eta squared, and that basically tells us how much of the difference in scores can be attributed to gender. And even in those 3 areas where they found statistically significant differences, gender only accounted for a tiny fraction of the variation. We're talking just 1 to 3%.
1 to 3%.
Yeah.
So even though boys, on average, scored a little higher in those 3 areas, gender itself didn't explain much about why some kids did better than others.
Exactly. Other factors like age, individual experiences, learning opportunities, things the study didn't specifically measure, likely played a much bigger role in those differences. And the researchers were very upfront about that.
That's a really important point. It's not just about boys versus girls. It's about recognizing that individual variation is huge and gender is just one tiny piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. And here's another interesting thing. They didn't find any significant interaction between gender and age for those overall cognitive domains. So those small average differences they did see, they didn't really change as the kids got older, at least within that 5 to 16 age range.
So those patterns, whatever they are, seem to hold relatively steady throughout childhood and adolescence.
Right. But where things get even more interesting is when we start looking at the specific subtests within those broader domains, because that's where we start to see some more nuanced findings.
Okay, so let's dive into the details. Tell me about those specific subtests. Where did they see some unexpected results?
Well, let's take sensory perception as an example. Remember, overall, boys had a slight average advantage in this domain, but one of the subtests within sensory perception was tactile recognition, that's being able to identify objects by touch alone. And on that particular task, girls actually outperformed boys.
So it wasn't just a blanket, boys are better at sensory things. There were some specific tasks where girls excelled.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that this difference in tactile recognition was more pronounced in the younger children. So there seems to be an interaction between gender and age going on there.
So maybe girls developed that tactile sensitivity a bit earlier than boys. Or maybe they're just more encouraged to explore things through touch when they're younger. Who knows?
There could be all sorts of explanations, and the study didn't really delve into those, but it's a fascinating observation. Now, when they looked at visual perception tasks within that same sensory domain, boys did tend to do better on tasks like identifying blurry figures, completing fragmented drawings, and mentally assembling parts of an object to recognize the whole. So there's definitely some variation within that sensory perception domain itself.
Right, so it's not just one big category. There are all these subtleties and nuances depending on the specific skills being assessed. What about oral language? What do they find there?
Well, for oral language, when they looked at the domain as a whole, boys did have a small average advantage in both how well they could express themselves verbally and how well they understood language. But again, when they looked at those individual subtests and applied some statistical corrections to account for multiple comparisons, the only difference that remained statistically significant was in language comprehension.
So boys, on average, might be slightly better at understanding what's being said to them, but that difference might not be as big as we sometimes assume.
Right. And it's worth noting that the effect size was still quite small, even for that language comprehension subtest. Now, for spatial abilities, the area we probably hear the most about when it comes to gender differences, the boys did outperform girls on a specific subtest called pictures from different angles. That's the one where you have to mentally rotate an object to recognize it from a different viewpoint.
Ah, so the classic spatial reasoning task. And that difference held up even after they controlled for things statistically.
Yes, that particular difference in spatial abilities was one of the more robust findings in the study. But again, it's crucial to remember that the overall impact of gender on those scores was still relatively small.
So maybe there's a slight tendency for boys to excel in that specific type of spatial task, but it's not a huge difference, and it doesn't tell us much about an individual boy or girl's spatial skills.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting. The researchers did something called a factor analysis on all those subtests from the ENI. And what they found is that the tests didn't actually group together neatly into those 7 defined domains.
Okay, now that's really interesting. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it suggests that those 7 domains, the way they've categorized these cognitive skills, might not reflect how these abilities actually operate in the brain. There might be some underlying connections and overlaps between skills that we traditionally think of as separate, like maybe some aspects of visual perception actually tap into spatial reasoning skills, or maybe certain verbal skills are linked to attentional processes.
So the categories themselves might be a bit artificial, or at least not fully capturing the complexity of how our brains work.
Right, and I think that's a really important takeaway because it reminds us that these categories, sensory perception, oral language, spatial abilities, they're useful for organizing our thinking, but they don't necessarily reflect these hard boundaries in the brain.
So if we zoom out and look at the big picture, what's the main message we should take away from all this research?
Well, I think the researchers summed it up really well in their own conclusion. They emphasized that for this group of Spanish-speaking children, the similarities between boys and girls in their cognitive development were far more prominent than the differences.
So even though they found those few specific areas where there was a statistically significant difference, those differences were relatively small and didn't really explain much about how these kids were developing cognitively.
Exactly. And they were very clear that those small differences shouldn't overshadow the much larger similarities in how boys and girls learn and grow.
So, as our listeners are thinking about everything we've discussed today, what's a question they can ponder? Something to really challenge their assumptions about gender and cognitive development.
Well, given all this evidence that boys and girls are actually much more alike than different in their cognitive development, what are the implications of focusing so heavily on those small average differences? Are we doing a disservice to kids, both boys and girls, by putting so much emphasis on those tiny variations?
That's a great point. Maybe instead of focusing on those small average differences, we should be celebrating the incredible diversity of talent and ability that exists within each gender and really nurturing each child's individual strengths.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, it's about recognizing and supporting the unique potential of every child, regardless of whether they're a boy or a girl.
Couldn't have said it better myself.